After launching my business partway through last year, I started getting the same feeling that I had when I started my first job, which was this feeling that I was an imposter. And I think the imposter syndrome is something that a lot of us feel. I think it's rife in our society. I think the reason for this is that we think about experience in terms of a linear progression. So we think about, for instance, that someone who has 20 years of experience in a job is going to know more than someone who has 3. But experience doesn't work like that. I mean, if you think about it, people in the Stone Age don't know as much as we know now. And that's because of accumulated knowledge. So the ABCs of starting a business is what I like to call always be curious. Because curiosity helps us to understand more about the world actively. So we are active participants in the world. So instead of linearly trying to just go through life day by day and hope that we learn some things along the way, curiosity is about actively seeking knowledge out. And this is key for starting a business. I don't think it's just key for starting a business. I also think it's key for not feeling like an imposter in your life and in your career. So tonight I'm going to share with you 5 habits for being curious that I've found really useful. The first habit is surround yourself with people smarter than you. So I think that can be pretty intimidating. Like to sit in a room and feel like you don't know much about something, that's scary. But at the same time, I think it really pays off. Because surrounding ourselves with brilliant people enables us to tap into something really quite extraordinary. If I speak to someone for 30 minutes and I can ask them some compelling questions about what they've learnt in their life and what they've learnt in their career, I can potentially, just in that slither of information that I get, I could save maybe 10 years of my own time trying to figure that out. And as a millennial, that's really important. So I'm a co-founder of our business. I was able to start my business when I was 26, and my business partner's in the room tonight, John Simmons. And and John is a creative. My background is as an account manager. So to me, John is basically what I consider magic. John can do amazing things with video. He can do amazing things with story, and I just can't do those things. But we work together at our media company. And so we used to go and get coffees together and just talk about work and talk about what we learned and what we were thinking about. And eventually, by being curious about each other, we ended up starting to hatch the plan for Pacific Content. And the rest is, as they say, the future. Now, for habit number 2, I want to ask you something first. And I want you to think about your answers carefully. So if I had a time machine up here at the moment, would you want to jump in? Would you be curious? What time period would you want to visit? Who would you want to speak to? What about if I could give you a free round-the-world trip? Would you want it? I think you would. Where would you want to travel to? Where would you want to go? What would you want to see? So I can actually offer you both of these things, so to speak, tonight when you go home, with habit number 2. And habit number 2, I think, is one of the most simple habits, and I think it's also one of the most effective. And that's to read books. I know that sounds really nerdy. But reading books allows us to travel space and time in a way that nothing else can. It allows us to spend time with someone's thoughts. We can spend time with the thoughts of a philosopher from the 17th century. We can hear what a Spanish artist thinks about the world. And I don't think anything else gives us that kind of knowledge and that kind of accessibility into someone else's mind. And what I think is really important about this is it does 2 things. 1, it helps us become more confident, because when people write books, they pour their heart and soul into it, and they tell us really embarrassing personal things about their lives. And that really kind of, I think for me, makes me feel like I'm not alone. I'm not the only person that sometimes has doubts about myself. There's a lot of other people out there. And these people wrote really amazing books. So that's pretty cool. And I think that's also what's humbling about it. That's number 2. Because no matter how much we learn, we realize there's still a lot more we could do. Now, if you want to start a business, the 3 books I would recommend, there's a lot more, but I've put it down to 3. One is Rising Strong by Brené Brown. 2 is Status Anxiety by Elaine de Botton. And 3 is The Organized Mind by Daniel Levitin. And if you say you don't have time to read books, then listen to audiobooks. But either way, read books. Habit number 3, I think, will surprise some of you. Habit number 3 is to write, to make, to create. I think when we think about curiosity, a lot of the time we're thinking about acquiring knowledge from the outside. We're thinking of going out into the world, going on the internet, going online and trying to acquire knowledge. But curiosity is also about being curious about ourselves. So with writing and with drawing and with externalizing thoughts, what we can do is we can tap into things that are happening subconsciously. Because there's a lot of things that circle around in our mind, but actually when we write them down, we can see them on paper and we can start to understand them better. So when I was 17, I started blogging. Yeah, I'm one of those people. And I have to say, as a proud nerd, it was a really, really useful thing to do. Because what blogging forced me to do was start to observe the world around me. I started to take a lot more notes and I started to write down ideas that I had about, for an article that I wanted to write. And what I found really interesting was that when I didn't write down my idea, I would forget it. Even if I actively tried to retrieve it after the fact, I would forget it. And what was also interesting is that as an avid reader, I would take down sort of like little notes from books that I'd read along the way. I'd tag the pages down so I could come back to ideas or write down quotes. But I didn't realize how much this was infiltrating my mind subconsciously. So when I'd look back on notes that I'd taken for article ideas and things a few months later, I could start to see, oh, hang on, this was the idea from this book that I'd read. But if you'd asked me at the time, I'd have no idea. I would have said, oh, it just came from my head. I think our memories are not as good as we think they are. I think they just give us the impression that they are good. So be creative, make stuff, write things down. Habit number 4 is be a scientist and don't be a scientist. So being a scientist is about asking questions about the world around us. My first degree was in science, where I studied physiology, psychology, and neuroscience. And to be quite frank with you, I really enjoyed the subjects, but I had no idea how it was going to get me a job. I thought that I didn't want to be a researcher, and I thought I was really stuffing up my career. But it has been extremely useful for starting a business, and it's been extremely useful in business. And the reason is that what science does is science teaches you how to methodologically think through problems. It teaches you how to observe things and design experiments and find rational solutions to problems. Now, as a marketing consultant, that's really important because what I'm doing with clients is helping them solve problems. And what's really interesting to me is that in the marketing, data-driven world of marketing, marketers are actually really bad at using data. Data's like chemicals. Data's everywhere. There's no such thing as data-free. It's just information. And if we start with assumptions when we're asking a question, it's very hard for us then to actually not be led by the assumptions. So we end up kind of cherry picking facts in order to come up with a solution. So I'll give you an example. Let's say we wanted to launch a protein shake to millennials. That's the brief from our client. Now, a scientific approach to that would be first to ask some questions about that brief. Things like, well, are millennials the best demographic to be marketing to? Why is that the case? Who are the competitors? What's your objectives? What are we hoping to achieve? But what I find a lot of marketers do is that they jump straight to a solution. So they'll say, this is how you market to millennials without first looking at the problem. And that's what being a scientist is about. It's about understanding the problem and finding a way to scientifically solve it. The reason I say don't be a scientist is there are things we can't measure and there are things that are difficult for us to understand, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't be curious about them. So for instance, take the journalist who can write headline after headline that people want to read. That's a journalist's job. Now we can measure that the article is successful or not. We can track that. We can see how many views it gets, how long people are spending on the page. But what we can't do is we can't really measure what's happening in the journalist's mind. We can't really understand that. But that doesn't mean that the journalist isn't doing a great job. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't respect the art of creativity. That's really, really important for business. So I think we need to be curious about things that we can't easily measure as well. The final habit is the most important one. It's also the hardest. And I think this speaks a little bit to what Sarah was talking about before. So habit number 5 is learn how to turn failures into opportunities to learn. A failure is something that every entrepreneur will say, oh yeah, I had to fail a lot of times before I eventually succeeded. And that's, for me, as a recovering perfectionist, terrifying. But I have to say that I've really learnt to appreciate this as a source of some of my greatest inspirations. Because what failure does is failure helps us to peer at the blind spots. It helps us to understand where we could be going wrong. Now, I should explain that when I say failure, I'm not just talking about big failures. I'm not just talking about things like bankruptcy or, getting kicked out of home or having a divorce. I'm talking about little failures. I'm talking about things like your boss saying, I was a bit disappointed in the way you delivered that pitch today. The things that make us feel ashamed of who we are, but they're little, but they're clues. They're important clues. So I like to think about failure the same way I think about pain. Pain is something that can help us avoid potential physical catastrophes down the road. Like, I have a pain and actually my appendix is about to burst. They're really important. Those signals are really important, and it's the same with failure. So looking out for failure and being able to sit with that comfortably and actually analyze it is really, really important. And that's what we need to be curious about, I think, the most. Curiosity has definitely helped me overcome the imposter syndrome. I think to be able to be confident in saying, I'm now 28 and I deserve to be in my business, I want to be in my business, and I really like my life, is really empowering. And I think being curious allows us to reach our potential. It allows us to do great things in our lives. So I hope tonight that I've encouraged you to be a little bit more curious. And I definitely hope that no one in here feels like an imposter anymore. Thank you for listening.